Thank you all for coming. I'm going to tell you a story. And the story began 30 years ago. So 30 years ago, scientists warned of the impacts of changing climate change. We actually knew much more about it decades before that. But in terms of the public part of our awareness nationally, Dr. James Hansen from NOAA was one of the first to come and testify in front of the Congress to say, we need to pay attention, we need to be concerned. We were introduced to things called global warming and something called greenhouse gases. So that was not in our Bone Act at that point in time. So that warning was talking to us about greenhouse gases and the increased emissions that humans were putting into the atmosphere. Things like carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide. So carbon dioxide, yeah, we all drive our cars and that spits out the carbon dioxide. Methane, okay, well, you know, those of you that have pets that you know, fart in the night, you know what methane's all about. But agricultural emissions, production of petroleum, et cetera, that's what we're talking about, methane. And nitrous oxide, the wonderful green lawn that you have, the manicured lawn, which you put fertilizers, emits nitrous oxide. So we do a lot of things in our life that are contributing to these increases in greenhouse gases. The scientists warned that what we were observing was this increase in the global average air temperature as well as the ocean temperatures. It was rising. When we looked at the sea level, it was also rising. And when we looked at the snow, which is our water reservoirs, our safety net, that was declining. They were very concerned about it, and they were presenting what was observed. Not projected to observe. This is a graph that's just showing you the number of days, of weeks, excuse me, that were over 100 degrees for every single day in that week. And in the 1970s, that's what it looked like. And they were warning with this increase, they were predicting this change of what that US pattern would look like into the 2020s. Well, we're actually there, a little bit past that, so they were right on. And they're warning going further into that as it was projected. So they were concerned about these climate changes, and they worked with the whole UN, the whole global community, to express that concern. We, the United States, entered into and signed, under the UN Convention, a framework convention on climate change. That's what you're listening to in the news about Paris Accord, Kyoto Protocol, et cetera. Those are underneath the convention. US signed the convention. The step down to any sort of implementation agreement is what we then negotiate, those terms. The whole ultimate objective was to stabilize the greenhouse gas concentrations. And you're supposed to do it especially at a level that would prevent the dangerous anthropogenic or human-caused interference with the climate system. So there's all these graphs and charts and things like this. This is one called a burning ember. The scientists tried to communicate their level of concern. So when I ask you, is your level of concern, you know, white, yellow, orange, red? That's your highest level of concern. Tell me what it is. And so scientists around the world looking at that, and within these different ways of evaluating it, they say, what's your concern in terms of how that's going to change the weather? And what you're seeing on the right-hand side is the number of degrees increasing global average by degrees Celsius. All right? So weather, yes, as you get higher, they're very much concerned. What's going to be the impact on our markets? Agriculture, energy, production, utilities, whatever. Okay, well there's that protest. And then what in terms of biodiversity? The unique habitats, species, and places that we care about. That report, that level of concern was expressed in 2004. So that's kind of the level of concern. When you look at it as it changes, and if you look, you know, pick one of those bars, and you see that changed just within 5 years. The new science says, oh, we have greater concerns now. We're seeing greater impacts. We're seeing what the trends are looking like. So the whole global community was aware of that, the science was there, and we were trying to communicate these many aspects of it. The science community was part of those negotiations and part of the whole process under the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, as Michelle mentioned. And the first report was in 1990. World authorities, most current understanding, looking at all of the impacts, all of the trends, all of the mitigations and options. The first assessment report was what they called the FAR in 1919. And so that has been updated every 7 years since. And so we have been updating the science, updating the impacts, updating our level of confidence, updating our level of concern. All that time. And then the most recent one was just recently published. So the science community has been warning that and has been talking about it. What's been the impact in terms of the broader society? Well, pretty much, why should I care? And part of that is just because, again, remember 30 years ago, we're talking about weather and climate. Really, should I care? That was the difference between weather and climate. Weather, of course, is the short term. Climate is the long-term trends, and generally we talk about it in the 30-year time horizon. And so you're talking about what's happening over a long period of time. Those little bars are showing you just variation on that year's average. And I mean, we expect variation, but the trend is always increasing. And so that's part of the problem, is that we had that portrait of what this means. Well, it's getting hotter, why do I care about that? And so that's kind of what we looked at in terms of computers and graphically portraying that. But the problem was the message was very too simplistic, but also because our tools, our analytical, our computational, our information that goes into those models was too simple and limited. And that's really come to its own. As a point of reference, when I talk about modeling, and when I started preparing this talk, and I thought, where were we 30 years ago? I found this article about this guy, this young entrepreneur called Steve Jobs, and he was presenting, you can have a computer on your desktop. We're going to call them workstations. You could have that. So think about that. That's where we were 30 years ago in that understanding. And where are we now? You can check your emails and phone, which we didn't even know what email was, on your watch now. Okay, so computational changes have facilitated our understanding and projections. What does that mean when you look at those impacts? Those are the climate drivers. Temperature, sea level, and precipitations are being driven, and they're impacting both the water resources that we have as well as our health. The issue of the forests and the fibers and the benefits that forests provide, as well as those in agriculture, all the food and fibers that they provide. And then, of course, on the coastal impacts, the issue of so many of our communities that live on the coast are impacted by storms, severe weathers, et cetera, or degrading coastlines, as well as ecosystems. So those are all the major areas that are being impacted. What Jane Lubchenco, who was also with NOAA years later, was to say, we're trying to communicate, was that it's not just about climate. It's about the things that people value. That's what we're talking about when we're talking about climate change. And I'm going to be talking about ecosystems and those impacts, those resources, and the people that are charged with managing for those. So ecosystem response is really what we're talking about, is they provide goods and services. What I mean by goods are things that we generally think of as monetized, things that we can make money on. Lumber, oil, or medicinal resources. So those are the goods that we can put a dollar value on. We monetize that. Less understood are what we call the services. Nature gives it to us for free, as long as we keep the system working. And I'm going to show you the various areas of these services. One is the biogeochemical. I'm just going to show you an example under each, nutrient cycles and how you enhance soils, etc. The hydrological, the issue of the quality of the water we have. It serves to actually filter out pollutants, pathogens, heavy metals, etc. Other services nature provides the atmospheric, obviously the air quality and the climate that we're talking about, as well as structural benefits. Things like on the storm, on the coastal areas, storm barriers, so the buffering the storm impacts or the wave damages. And then, of course, in biological, which probably most of us are much more aware of. So these are all the things that we have that are non-monetized, that we don't think of the value that nature provides us. So let me talk to you about what climate is doing to those systems. You have a terrestrial system here in which, as the climate warms, as the temperatures increase, it has evapotranspiration. It starts taking the moisture from the soils, from the vegetation, and in the respiration is actually throwing that moisture up into the air, as well as on land, on freshwater and other marine systems. It's pumping that water, this is part of the natural cycle, into the atmosphere. Water vapor is actually one of the most powerful greenhouse gas trapping additions to the climate dynamics. So as the surface heats, more water is going into the system, and that is in fact increasing in terms of the greenhouse gases. In this example, what you have is a pinyon pine. It's taking the gases, carbon dioxide in this case, out of the atmosphere, using it to grow and thrive through photosynthesis. It's also releasing that through respiration, and that's where our soil moisture and vegetation moisture is going back in the atmosphere. When you have the increased temperature, you're pumping. More and more is pumping out of those reservoirs, all of the soil. And this is an example of pinyon forest in which, just because of drought, lack of water, the trees start to die. Within 2 years period of time, that same area was transformed to that. They all died. They have an experienced drought. Sometimes they can recover, but with the current types of climate change, it's actually pushing that back out. So we're creating drought-stressed environments which are dying off, and as they die off, they're actually decomposing, or maybe they're burning, all of which is increasing and putting more gases back into the atmosphere, more greenhouse gases. There's a feedback loop. That's the important take-home message here. It's not, oh, you need to put on a sweater or you need to take off a sweater. It's not weather, it's climate and how that's changing the systems. More importantly for us is the issue of how it changes our water availability or water storage. When the temperatures are well below freezing, all that moisture that's up in the clouds comes down as snow. That's normally what happens. As you increase the temperature, what happens is less snow and more rain. More rain, more heavy rain events. And what that does is it's hitting the earth, and because you have such large volumes now, rather than percolating down through the soil, which is normally what happens and is stored there, it's actually running off because the soil is saturated and you can no longer maintain it. So you're losing the water that had been stored as snow into precipitation. And what that means is less snowpack in the shorter periods that they're covered in snow cover also means another feedback loop. The surface is actually increasing the temperature and the reflectiveness. If you've gone out skiing and you have to wear sunglasses, right, because the snow is reflective, that is taking the heat and reflecting it back into space. When the snow is gone, then we're going to go ahead and continue to increase that cycle. That's the issue. What's happening to those species, like those tree species in the tropics? Well, species have only three options. They either track the climate, follow it, they adapt to the conditions, or they go extinct. And so when you talk about tracking the climate, what I'm going to show you here is a graph, and it's looking at just one aspect of it, looking at drought. So you have drought intensity and drought duration. In California, you know a lot about drought duration. But intensity is one high and low, and density short and long. So you have a species that lives within this certain, what we call a climate envelope. They're used to living within those bounds. And under climate change, what's happening is the threshold, which moves from able to stay their niche or suitable habitat into a dangerous increased mortality, is happening. And the pinyon pines that I showed you in that earlier, this is an example of that. That climate envelope had shifted, had moved into this future conditions, and you see the species are now subject to that new level of impact in terms of the drought intensity. And again, that's the result, is that change. And the point is that when you lose that, that was the issue of the pinyon pine. But you have jays that are dependent on the pinyon pine. So there's a cascading environmental impact of other species which are dependent on those aspects. Species can adapt. They can sit in place and adapt for a period of time. This is the case of the eastern brook trout, which is a cold adapted species. They lay their eggs on the or reds in the stream, and when the stream gets too hot, the female will stand over it and with her tail cool it, keep it cool until they're able to erupt. And so the issue is that works for a while. And so if you can't shift, well, you have some aspect. There are some species that have, just in terms of their genetic potential, the ability to phenotypically, how they look, to change. This is a sea anemone. And what you see is when they are in an environment which is low on nutrients, low on the ability to feed themselves, those little arms sit there and they swat particles of food into that mouthpiece, that central piece, in order to survive. When the temperatures change, things start to decompose, etc., and that becomes limited, they can, in fact, develop those longer arms. That's called phenotypic plasticity. They're sitting there and they're still trying to maintain a living, even though that's changed. Very few examples of that, but they do exist. You can actually change the genetics. Not most of the organisms we care about, but the genetics can be changed. This is an example of an aphid. Well, the genetics didn't change on the aphid. The genetics changed on the biogut flora of the aphid. As things got hotter, the types of gut flora evolved. It changed its genetics to be more heat tolerant because it's in an organism that can be susceptible to the heat changes. And so again, you have examples of genes shaking, but they don't happen in most of the organisms that we are cared about or concerned about or rely on economically because of the amount of time for those genetics to evolve. But in bacteria and viruses and everything else, we're turbocharged. The other aspect that they can adapt is they can change their phenology. So we know about phenology as when seeds are set or flowers or nesting and young are produced. The issue there is, in this example with the birds, you can change when you start nesting in response to the temperature. And that's what happened with these birds. But the issue is that the insect that they required also changed. It got hotter and they erupted, did their life cycle, and moved on. So when the birds needed them to feed the young, the food source was already gone. So you do see phenological changes of those timings. There can be, and often are, a mismatch. The other issue is migration patterns. In this case, you have these incredible caribou herds that move. They migrate with their calves. They go from the winter grounds up, follow the new flush of vegetation. New flush of vegetation is rich in nutrients and helps the calves survive. Well, caribou are cued into day length. Day length hasn't changed. The temperature that the vegetation, the plants that they rely on, changed. That, in those spring grounds, they flushed, and they're rich, and then they start to die and lose all their nutrients. And so, what happens is when the herds come in, it's like eating at McDonald's. Not a lot of nutrients into that. So you have those options, but we have a lot of examples that shows you that that's really not a great storyline. The other way is go extinct. And there's many ways to go extinct. This is just one, that you can exceed the physiological tolerance. So things like ectotherms that rely on their body temperature are reflected on the surrounding temperatures, like amphibians and reptiles or invertebrates, insects, things. So again, if they can't adapt, change, it exceeds their physiological tolerance, and they will die. And a population can go extinct, or a whole species can go extinct. The other way of looking at this physiological tolerance is change in the environment. This is an example in which you have two species. When you change the temperature gets moved as well. So what used to be one temperature has now been elevated, and so those cooler temperatures up at the top tend to be lost. And so that's the case, that when that happens, those species are lost because the temperatures have been lost and others have moved up and taken over that spot. And that's the case with the pika. One of the earliest articles I ever wrote was entitled "The Pika Toast." So what you're showing is that the fact that temperature tolerance, remember, that climate envelope has moved in 1990 from 7,000 to 9,000, and basically they're running out of space. They are exceeding their physiological tolerance, and they basically are toast. The other way to go extinct is to actually lose the critical habitat. And you've probably have seen and heard things about polar bears that require sea ice. And of course, that's melting increasingly. They require that to be successful at hunting their prey, seals, for example. And so when that's being lost, their ability to hunt is reduced, their ability to survive is reduced. And we are starting to already see that in populations of polar bear as well. Another aspect is a very critical part of habitat that you're not looking at. It's aspects of the habitat. This is looking at cloud forests in Monteverde, in which the water comes in these clouds that are in these high elevations. They don't come as precipitations, they're droplets that are on the vegetation. And the issue is there are animals like the amphibians, like the golden toad here, that rely on that wind-blown precipitation. It's critical habitat that's lost as it gets increased temperature and those clouds move off the top of the mountains. You lose the cloud forest, and you actually experience these extinctions. This is actually one of the, that I'm aware is the very first species to actually go extinct on the island. So what you're seeing is these disruptive changes, and that's what natural resources managers like myself are trying to deal with. We're having biomes that are moving, species that are moving, and the species that are there are changing in terms of who's there. I started working on this when, if you can believe it, it was more politicized than it is today. And so we used to have to point to this, that the Arbor Day Foundation had this little handout that you could get. You can go to your nursery, say, where do I need to plant? What's temperature tolerant for my plants in my area? And they'd give you this. Well, they said, oh shoot, we need to republish this because this is no longer appropriate. It doesn't work. And so what you're seeing is that these shifts of the biomes. So, for example, in the northern part of Minnesota, those boreal or peat areas are moving out. You're losing them. And actually, we no longer have subtropical. Florida actually has tropical habitats or biomes within its boundaries now. And as one scientist had said, these types of changes are going to affect everything, the structure and the function of the ecosystem. It's going to impact how species interact, where they are, their ranges, and it's going to have tremendous consequences to the amount of biodiversity that we currently have, as well as those ecosystem services that I talked about in the beginning. So when you're looking at that, we know that there are biomes that will shift and can be completely lost to the regions and will be. So the other aspect is the species will shift. They, biologist Charles Darwin, close and dear to my heart, he got it wrong. He said communities would move in response to these changes, these temperatures. Well, communities don't, species do. And actually, they move independently. So the whole community doesn't move. Things that no longer were there can all of a sudden move into that area. And this is the example of the sage grouse, in which grass, open sage areas was how these sage grouse relied on that environment to breed. They have a lek system or to raise the young. But with climate change, shrubs are moving into that space. You're losing the grasslands. And so that's what's happening to that biome. The species are shifting in and taking over those areas. There's another aspect of that, and again, when looking at those cloud forests, and this is the quetzal in Costa Rica, in which they're high elevation, very secretive birds, very spectacular, and they're only found there at the highest elevations. They nest there, but what is happening is a more aggressive toucan is moving into that area because it's becoming warmer, and you have these ants, really wicked ants, moving up into that elevation, and they're actually eating. If the quetzal is able to produce young, and the toucans don't beat them up so that they can't successfully nest, and they produce the young, then the ants will come and eat the offspring. So this sort of change in community structure is happening. And the point is that we as managers have to be able to look at and anticipate that. But this is what we call a non-analog. We got nothing to look at. Not into paleontological, nothing in the recent history. So we don't really know what that is going to look like. An aspect of that non-analog is how the species turn over, the composition. Well, this is barred and spotted owls. So the issue is if you are the manager of a protected area and you're in charge of managing for an endangered species, and another species moves in and beats the hell out of them, what do? You have this turnover that you have to deal with. And so what you're looking at here is the map on the left, which is actually looking at the Badlands National Park. And they looked at the number of species that you can anticipate a turnover based on how the temperature and precipitations are going to change. And that net turnover for just Big Bend is looking at a species loss, but a species gain. So what's the purpose of the protected areas? How are they interacted? What are they doing? So the point is you have the potential for conflicts on a lot of different scales, and that's the sort of world that we're involved in. So we're back to my cast of characters, natural resource managers. What can we do? Well, we actually have proven effective tools that have to kind of be tweaked now, and we have new approaches. The first is to identify climate refugia. And so that means that we have a whole series within the United States of these protected areas. So like the national parks, we believed we could just set aside these areas, keep everyone in there, and just as long as we kept those boundaries, they'd be fine. Well, we've already shown that they're moving out and things are moving in, and all that's changing. So our national parks, our national forests and grasslands, our wildlife refuges, and national marine sanctuaries, all of which we've relied on, all of which are no longer going to serve us under climate change in the aspect of how they might serve us is as climate refugia. There are aspects within those areas that are going to be buffered. They're going to be a refuge for those changing climate. We need to identify them by the species, by those changes, and actually look at it. This is the Canadian lynx and the snowshoe hare. That's the current forest distribution. You see, and the issue is when you're looking at what that change is going to be, it's not just, oh, it's all going to move up. It's very complex. And when you look at what the projected forest is, and that's showing you that you need to identify where the future range might be as those species respond. And what you're seeing in the bottom right is the boundary of the forest refuge. The red is the current distribution of the lynx that we can project would be lost. And what are the ones that we think are going to be buffered from that? So looking at protected areas and seeing what species they will serve, what species that might be the only place where we have them, is really what we're looking at in terms of changing our tools and our approach to conservation. We also need to ensure that there's connectivity. So we need to go beyond the protected areas, beyond our jurisdictional or state authorities, and work across that, or even land ownerships, even the private industries. This yellow is the outline of the refuge, which is bounded by the city of Philadelphia and the Philadelphia airports. So if you're a species within the Hines Wildlife Refuge and you need to migrate to follow or track climate, you have a real obstacle. And we see that everywhere in different levels, and of course it depends on the species and the organisms and the obstacles, but that's ubiquitous across the landscape. We have historically been trying to deal with that, and of course there are things that we do that put the animals at risk in their attempts to just move on their own. But one of the things we've done is establish these travel corridors. They can either be above main highways or underneath them. Again, the point is to allow the species to move. And what we need to do is also expand land use. This shows the current population in the United States as of 2000. More blue is the more densely populated. And the scary part about it is that by the end of the century, that number will triple. So just imagine your house and all the people that are there, or the traffic, or trying to get past people on 17-mile drive, and it's triple the amount that you're doing it. So the issue of population is a major aspect of that. What I want to show you is also how we have gobbled up land. So we're looking at the number of housing units. This happens to be the southeast of the United States, which at the time had the highest rate of population growth. I'm going to step through a series by years. So if you can just look at those redder colors, which are the most increased number of housing units per square kilometer. So 1940s, 50, 60, 70, 80, 90. And here we are, 2000, and looking at that. All right, so again, what part of the natural world is able to utilize that space as humans take and dominate that landscape? So the other aspect is we need to reduce other stressors. What I mean by other stressors is there's a whole ton of them. You do a whole other lecture on that. I'm just going to look at a couple. One is the issue of invasive species. species that either don't have those predators or have a competitive advantage. Often they're introduced species from another continent. So they become invasive, like this fish that comes in, the snakehead that actually eats everything that's in that area. And they take over and they gobble everything up and transform it. In the southeast, if you've been there, this vegetation, kudzu, it goes and it goes everywhere, and it topples trees, it topples houses, takes over cars. So it's invasive and it consumes everything in its path and becomes loss of biodiversity, just one monotypic. The other aspect is the issues of fire, pest, and disease. On the left, you're seeing the issue of bark beetles coming in and killing off those trees. And of course, fire is a major issue of not only from the temperature, but because of those dead and dying vegetation. There's a saying that climate change may not be the smoking gun, but often it's the one that pulls the trigger. What you have is an effect which can either be additive, multiplicative, or synergistic and antagonistic. So you have those other stressors, and climate just comes in to give it one last kick. The easiest way to think about this is if you're a person, and I would say that person is immunocompromised. How susceptible is it to disease and those changes? And so that's what we're talking about when we're talking about these other stressors, and especially a lot of the invasives or changes. We know that in terms of these other drivers, not just climate, but multiple ways in which we have extinction, that has been a major one. We are in what they call the 6th mass extinction. And the outcome of that is we've lost 12% of the birds, 21% of the mammals, 30% of the amphibians, 35% of the invertebrates, 37% of all the freshwater fish, mussels, and 28% of the reptiles. And if you just look at one species of the marine turtles, down and lost 76%. This mass extinction event is sometimes referred to, you might have heard the term, the Anthropocene, the time of man. And we have come in, gobbled up, and have destroyed and driven to mass extinction a number of these species. And so in that issue of what's going extinct, Ron Pullian, who used to be the science advisor for the Department of Interior and also the president of the Ecological Society of America, said that future conservation challenges under climate change will require action when inaction carries a real risk of extinction. So as a natural resource manager, that is required by federal mandate or state jurisdiction to take your public trust and make sure those species remain and are cared for into the future. This is a big challenge. What we need to do is to facilitate the ability of species, of habitats, and the ecosystems to accommodate the climate changes. For the natural resource managers, we are now in a position where we must direct change. When I started in this industry, that was a really frightening term. Now the issue is inaction carries the risk of extinction. And so what I'd like to introduce to you today is something which is brand new within our industry, our profession, something called transformational ecology. What I mean by that is that's the science, the different type of ecology. We are going to study the ecology, the systems, the dynamics, the drivers of change, of the transforming. Again, we'd have these non-analog situations. What's going to happen? We need to look at these transformations. And so that's what this is this transformational ecology is the fundamental science. As managers, the issue is how are you going to implement the science? And what we have is what's called the RAD framework, and I'll explain what that is. So transformational ecology is the recognition that climate is forcing these alternate states. I talked about going from grassland into shrublands or losing boreal forests entirely. So we need a future-oriented approach to this ecological transformation and to species turnover. And so this is an example looking at the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. This is Alaska. I know some of you, geography was a long time ago, but that's Alaska. And that's that little circle area is the Kenai National Wildlife Refuge. And from space, this is what it looked like in 1986. It was dominated by spruce, and that's what that green mass is looking at. And what's happened is it has transformed, and it has been transformed into grasslands. And so that same satellite imagery in 2014 is showing you that expansive grasslands. That has been a result of these increased fires. They can be anthropogenic, human-caused, or increased fire through lightning strikes. Or the point is that when the fire comes in, these invasive grasses come in ahead of any natural vegetation. And they are themselves increased inflammability. And so that then is a system which is just evolving to degradation. Historically, those sort of grasslands are kept in check by natural grazers. But there aren't any natural grazers up there. In our time, there has not been. So that's this transformational ecology. That's what is being transformed. And from a manager's standpoint, the issue is we are charged with the environment, but we serve society. This is a social agenda. What does society want and expect and demand? And so what you're looking at is this issue of, okay, we're here with this grasslands. What does the manager of Kenai National Wildlife Refuge do? Well, under the RAD framework, which stands for resist, accept, or direct, resist. Well, habitat's changing, temperatures are changing, water's temperature. Not a lot you can do to resist that change. You can accept whatever's happening and basically lose that refuge. For whatever value it was created, it'll turn into this fire-driven wasteland. Or you can direct the change. Okay, this becomes the social agenda. What was the refuge established for? What is it serving? And in Alaska, as in many of our refuges, it's actually serving many of the people, indigenous people, the issue of subsistence, hunting, etc. So when it's all transforming, and they had relied on the salmon and the moose, what is that new reality, that transformed ecology look like? One idea is to then, okay, well, let's manage for lodgepole pine. That's the next thing that comes into that climate envelope, and then there'll be deer, and then they can have that. That's an approach. Another approach is to look at that issue of, okay, well, you have this grasslands, you can start managing the fires, prescribe burns, and having those less intense, and you can actually introduce grazers. Bison, never been there? Introducing. Okay, most people get really frightened when we talk about that. Well, the issue is the refuges managers are struggling with this. This is the transformational ecology, and this is our challenge. Their neighbors, the Alaskan burros, with all those people that rely on that, they're doing that. It's their land, they can do what they want. So the issue is that there are these dynamics. And again, there are many benefits to humans and human society that the environment provides. And as natural resource managers, we're charged with keeping that system functioning, maybe not intact exactly as it looks like, but functioning for some purpose. And it's a dialogue, and that's a dialogue that will continue. What I'd like to do is just go through 3 examples of how we've used this resist, accept, and direct framework. These are published papers, and basically, although the National Park Service published this one on the left, it was 12 other federal agencies got together and came up with this sort of guidance. The one in the center looks at the state wildlife managers. So endangered species, et cetera, might be managed, responsible by a federal entity, but things like hunting, those sorts of aspects of this non-threatened species fall within the purview of the states. But again, even the species that are common are becoming rare. So the states are also working with that, and then on the bottom is showing you the professional organizations. This is the American Fisheries Association. Everyone's putting that, how are we going to take this new science, transformational ecology, and putting it into how we need to manage. And again, this resist, accept, and direct. This example is an example of the Park Service that's actually trying to resist. Okay. Resist is kind of hedging your bets. You got a period of time that it might work, but there's a dynamic. You can't stop the change. And so that's it. And they're looking at down in the Florida Keys into areas that they're responsible for managing, because they manage not only the recreational, but the natural and cultural resources of the parks. And so you have this rich, tremendous diversity in coral formations. When the temperatures of the sea change and become hot, the organisms inside those skeletons of the coral leave. There are many different types, what we call different clades, and they have different heat tolerances. And the issue is that if the temperatures go for an extreme period of time, then the whole coral ecosystem, all that coral dies, because the biological components, the zooxanthellae, those clades, left. Temperature's too hot, can't survive, gotta leave. Well, sometimes they can come back if it hasn't been too severe. Or sometimes they don't get impacted at all. And that's what the Park Service is studying. It's actually looking at that and trying to keep the coral ecosystem intact. Not necessarily the individual organisms that were creating the corals. So again, remember we talked about these changes of how species are going to happen. The Park Service has underwater nurseries, and they're actually growing various types of corals and selecting those which are more heat tolerant, and so putting them in ahead of these heat events. So they're trying to resist the change for as long as they can, and using that of which are the ones that are more heat resistant or have more populations response where they can actually rebound quicker. So that is part of the resist approach. This is one which I'm calling accept. Acadia National Park, which is up in Maine. It's in kind of right at the very southern part of the boreal region. So again, that boreal region moving. The species, and this is the number of species, tree species, in the parks currently. And they looked at and were saying what's going to happen with these assemblages under warming. And so what you're looking at is those species which are projected to decline, completely be exterminated, or X's, or maybe not. And so you can see much of that is going to be transformed. And we said the boreal is going to be the most impacted. The way the managers are looking at that is, okay, we have this condition where we know species, trees are going to change. We also know we have those other stressors. So we have all sorts of pests and pathogens that are killing the forest. So the forests that are there, that are projected to decline, the ones that are there are getting slammed. Climate change, right? Pulling the trigger. And so they will leave, they will die. What's going to move in? Well, again, what they're looking at is most likely these fast-growing invasive species. They're just going to come in, anything that's open, they'll plant, they'll grow up, and they'll smother everything out. It'll all become that. And so again, is that what you went to Maine to see? What is the value of that ecosystem? Why are you managing that area? And so what they're actually doing in terms of this acceptance is they've started these what they call common gardens. They have plots of various species of trees that are either currently there or might move in, where they can try to reestablish or put them into those areas. They need to figure out first, where are the suitable places for each of those species to grow in these changing conditions? Which of them are going to survive? And so what they actually need to do is to direct that in terms of the species selection. At the moment, they don't have the research information to make those decisions. But importantly for this example, they rely heavily on citizen science. So all of you are here in a wonderfully rich area, and many of the land trusts, parks, marines, etc., utilize citizen science, utilize citizens where they come in and help monitor these changes. The ones that I showed you of changing into these invasive populations, they're using citizens to go out and they're saying, okay, we want you to go in and inventory which species are there. Oh, and if you see any of these invasives, let me know and let's map them. Natural resource managers can't do them all by themselves. Not funded, not staffed, scope and challenge too great. But citizen science is an incredible tool to utilize and to bring that to bear on changing the future. The next example is what I call directing change. We talked about these climate envelopes, and if you have a habitat that's going to change, and it's going to change by X number of degrees in X number of years, the question is, well, what does it look like? Well, you can actually, in North America, go down south someplace and find out what the projected temperature and precipitation are going to look like. And so the black is the area which is hardwood hills, hardwood forest and hills. And the future, the analog, what it will be, is in this green. And so what you're looking at is just one type of biome. And again, we have the boreal, and where is its analog? Well, the same temperature and precipitation, you'd have to go down to that location. And then the southwest prairies, the grasslands, okay, that's its distribution. So you're looking at these analogs, you're projecting what the climate is going to look like with temperature and precipitation. You're going to move into these boreal peatlands are going to have a decrease in the forested areas, and they're going to become savannas, because trees are not just going to move in fast enough. Those that are in the hardwoods are going to become these dry savannas that are going to be transitioned into prairies. And in those, the southwest prairies, which are a unique habitat formation, you're going to have these shifting into, from a very moist or mesic types of grasslands into very dry prairies. This is what we can expect. This is what it will look like in those areas currently. So one of the ways that managers are looking at that is, again, that resist, accept, direct. Well, boreal, for a period of time, you can resist, you can buy some time for a while. And up there, basically, you can have legislation or work with people to prevent the draining of wetlands. So trying to prevent the damage that were already occurring to have a resilience. When you look at the hardwoods, what you're going to actually do is direct that transition to grasslands, because if you don't, you know the invasives are going to go in there and take over. And then in the grasslands, in those unique prairies, prairies are wonderful, and we've lost so much of them. But we've lost a lot of the seed formation. We don't have the seeds to create those unique, rich prairies that are central part of the United States used to be known for. But some of the agricultural lands do. They have seed banks that you can look at. So we need to identify those and start acquiring them if we're going to have that sort of seeding experiment. So, the name of this talk was Time's Up. We all have to make a choice. We all need to make a choice. And when I look back on where we've been and where we are in that 30 years, one of the things you look at is how the temperature has changed. The graphs that scientists would use would have a zero. What the hell's zero? Okay, the zero means if you look at that 30-year average from 60 to 90, 1960 to 1990, and whatever you make that as your baseline. And then you compare, and you look at the years back, from the industrial age of the 1800s up to 2000. What does the temperature look like? How do you map that onto that? How do you compare? This is the map of all those years. And again, you see the variability, and that makes sense. We're looking at long-term and trends. And regardless of the whatever time period you look at, either 150 years, 100 years, 50 years, 25 years, it's the same story. The climate is increasing, but more importantly is that we're increasing that rate of change. And so what that means is where we are, we say, have we failed? Well, when I started a career, we were like driving the car, towards the cliff. And scientists said, stop, put the brakes on. And instead, we as a society have made another choice. And for many of us, the issue is that some systems, some economies, some resources, some species, this is our reality, that we either are at the cliff or over the cliff. So time is up. We need to make those changes, we need to make the choices. And so the point is that, why haven't we? We've been doing this, we've been talking about this for 30 years. Is it that we haven't translated science? I don't think that's the case. Is it how we've communicated? Well, we've had this before, and the issue is that maybe we've just been using the wrong way of communicating. This fear thing is not working. That's possible, and I know there's been a lot of dissertations and master's thesis in sociology and journalism, etc., that made a living off of this idea. What I'm wondering is the lack of perception of urgency. Do they not understand the cost of delay? And I reflect on where we are at this point in time with the pandemic, and I look at that as my model. We were warned of a pandemic, and now we're living with that pandemic. So the issue is, can we not envision change? Can we not see the urgency, the need, the magnitude of this? And I actually think that's part of it. And so I'm hoping through this course and through what I'm sharing with you, that you will have a better able to envision that change. Just to show you how that will unfold as the temperature, the global average temperature changes. We've already increased it. We will experience a wave of extinctions as well as having these environmental impacts. We already know. Decreased water, increased drought, increased fire, increased flood and storm. As you increase each of those temperatures, global averages, you will increase the risks of extinctions. You will have major changes in the whole natural system, and that will affect the biodiversity and include the fact that we will lose our wetlands, and the total number of species that sustain those systems can be lost, and that's why we're always talking about keeping it down to these lower numbers. We cannot envision that. So the point is, how will you respond to climate change? We make those choices every day, and you can do it every day in a number of different ways. And I'm not just talking about, oh yeah, I have an electric vehicle now, or I recycle. You can do it. I sat there and I started to put that on the slides because I thought, whoa, they need to know what they can do. All right, I ended up with 3 slides, and the type was like 8 points. And so the point is, there's a lot of things you can do. Happy to talk about it, but you can do it, and you can make that choice. The issue is we need to all envision what this change needs to be. We have negotiations going on right now, again, under the Framework Convention, which we've already assigned and agreed to, we need to stop and prevent these dangerous impacts on the climate system. And the point is that climate is not a problem in the future, it's a problem now. I started my career with this, and I'm living with it now. The point is that the actions we take now will determine our future. And it will influence the quality of our life, the costs, opportunities or lost opportunities, as well as the impacts, and most importantly, those risks. Failure to act is not an option without risk. It's just a different kind of risk. And that's the situation we find ourselves in today. So thank you.